And welcome back to the video lecture series for Philosophy 119, Ethical Leadership, offered through the Pennsylvania State University. I'm Dr. William Behun. Kant begins his search by asking the question of what is good in and of itself, in all circumstances and without condition. And his answer is a good will. The goodness of the good will is not derived from the results that are produced. Even if the good will fails, it's still good. To take an example, if I give money to charity and the charity misspends or loses that money, my will to do good still remains. And this is an important point for Kant. As we've noted above, the morality of an act is not derived from anything that results from the act, but only from the will involved. So what makes a good will good? Later on in the text, Kant will tell us that a willing creature is one that is capable of acting from its own idea of law, that is to say, from a principle. So where do we derive the principles that guide the will? It seems that in the human being, every part, every organ, every system is adapted to a specific purpose. The eyes are for seeing, the heart is for pumping blood. We also have a part that's adapted specifically to the purpose of guiding the will. This organ, if you will, is reason. So then we say that a will is good if it acts in accordance with reason. It's ultimately from reason that we derive our moral standard, the moral law. Now, often we're inclined to act other than according to the dictates of reason. Our passions, our impulses, instincts sometimes pull us in other directions. When we act morally, we act in accord with reason whether we're inclined to do so or not. This is not to say that inclination is something bad, but only that when reason and inclination conflict, we're morally obligated to choose our reason, our duty, over our immediate inclinations. Let's take an example. Let's say a friend invites me out for coffee at a time when I normally have office hours. I know that I ought to be available during my office hours, but my inclination is to go with my friend. In this case, if I am to act morally, I must fulfill my obligation to be available during my office hours, despite the fact that I'm not particularly inclined to do so. And it's my reason that tells me this. So what do we know from this? Since I'm sometimes inclined to do things that I know are morally wrong, inclination and self-interest can't be the source of the moral worth of an action. However, when I act from duty, I know that my actions have moral worth. Now, let's take a moment to clarify a point that's often misunderstood in Kant. He says that an act has moral worth when it is done solely for the sake of duty, and not out of any inclination or self-interest. Now this seems to say, if I do something that is in accord with duty, but I do it out of self-interest, the action has no moral worth. For example, if I give money to charity in order to get a deduction on my income taxes, I act not from duty, but from self-interest. Do I therefore do something wrong? No, the point that Kant is making here is that an act has worth insofar as it is done from duty. That is to say, it's doing one's duty that gives the act moral worth. If I also act from inclination, this doesn't detract from the moral worth of the act. As we said above, for Kant, the results of an action don't determine its worth, but rather it's the maxim or the formal principle from which I act that gives an act its moral quality. A maxim is a principle from which I act. In the early example, when I attend my office hours rather than having coffee with my friend, the maxim from which I act is something like this. I ought to make good on my obligations or promises. It's this principle that determines the moral worth of the action. If my maxim is rational, then it's a good maxim. Now, there are two kinds of maxims, subjective and objective. A subjective maxim is that upon which we do act. An objective maxim is one on which every rational being would act if it were totally rational. When we act from duty, we make an objective maxim our subjective maxim, and this is the goal. Morality is ultimately derived from a formal maxim, empty of content. Doing one's duty no matter what that duty is. Now this doesn't tell us what our duty is. That's the content. Kant tells us duty is the necessity to act out of reverence for the moral law. But what is this comportment of reverence? Well, the word Kant uses in German is Achtung. This feeling of reverence unites two different aspects of the moral law. Insofar as the moral law must be equally valid for all rational creatures, because it is itself rational, it must be universal. This law commands. It appears as imposed on us from above, much like a religious command, and as such it elicits something like fear. However, the law also appears as something self-imposed, which is to say that it comes from my own reason. In this sense, it elicits something like inclination. Achtung, reverence, is the feeling that relates the two. The law is imposed by our own rational nature. Thus it commands and appears as self-imposed. So if we put all of our conclusions together so far, a form of the moral law emerges, and this is what Kant calls the categorical imperative. I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that the maxim of my actions should become a universal law. Simply put, I ought to act out of reverence for a law that ought to apply to all rational beings by virtue of their rationality. In our discussions, we'll look at some of the ways in which this categorical imperative plays out, and how we might apply it in order to better understand the nature of moral actions.